Thank you very much, Minister. I will now open the floor for questions. And let me begin by inviting Ms. Dancho. 6 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank the Minister for being with us today on relatively short notice. And Minister, I'd like to talk a little bit about, I've lived in Montreal for a number of years. It's deeply important to me that we see the issue of gun violence solved in that country, but we also see violent crime across Canada. I represent a riding in Winnipeg, and we're seeing increased violence there as well. In fact, violent crime across Canada, 5 of the last 6 years has gone up. Firearms-related offenses have increased for 6 years in a row now. Homicides are at a 30-year high, and we know at least 1/3 of homicides are committed with firearms. And so as long as I've been alive, homicides haven't been this bad. I think that's pretty serious, and we're hoping for serious action from your government. And Winnipeg itself is on track to surpass its 2019 homicide record, and it's also ranked the violent capital of Canada in 2020. So Conservative members are taking the violent crime we're seeing surging across the country over the last 6 years very seriously. But we are also disappointed that following one of the shootings this fall in Montreal, I think it was even the day after, your government introduced Bill C-5, which removes mandatory prison time, as you know, for robberies with a firearm, extortion with a firearm, weapons trafficking, discharging a firearm with intent to injure, and using a firearm in the commission of a crime. And so we're quite concerned that on one hand, we're seeing criminals using often illegally smuggled guns to harm our communities. And on the other hand, your government is taking away the ability to ensure they have mandatory prison time. I'd like to know, Minister, if you believe Bill C-5 will keep criminals responsible for the shootings in Montreal and others across the country off our streets.
I do, Ms. Dancho, and before I tell you why, I want to thank you for your advocacy and for bringing your experiences both in Winnipeg and Montreal to this committee. I will say that Bill C-5 does ensure that a number of mandatory minimum penalties with regards to firearms offenses, serious firearms offenses, do remain in place. And not only that, as I have said, there are a number of serious firearms offenses to which we propose to increase maximum penalties, which of course we trust our independent judiciary to dispense where appropriate. I will also say, Ms. Dancho, that as I outlined in my remarks, our government takes this issue very seriously, which is why we have introduced additional gun controls, particularly the banning of assault rifles. And we are now going to take the next steps to do whatever it takes to reduce gun violence, because I believe we are all joined in that cause.
We don't share your belief that that allowing criminals who use firearms in robberies for extortion and serious gun crimes like that, we believe that they should go to jail, and that would help clean up our streets. We are concerned that Bill C-5 is allowing these criminals to return to our streets and ensure violence continues. Another issue we know is deeply tied to gun violence in Montreal and Toronto is, of course, drug trafficking, pushing of opioids, fentanyl, heroin. We know opioids kill 7,000 Canadians a year, and yet this Bill C-5 also reduces or eliminates the mandatory prison time for drug traffickers. And so we're quite concerned that we know gang violence, gun violence is deeply interrelated with drug trafficking. And yet on one hand, you're taking away the ability for mandatory prison time for those who commit dangerous, violent gun crime and those who are pushing drugs on people that are killing 7,000 Canadians a year. So again, we see Bill C-5 completely opposite of what needs to be done to address the gun violence and the gang and drug trafficking activity that is fueling that in our cities. And again, in Manitoba alone, we have 372 drug-related deaths in 2020. So we find this to be very serious. Does the minister believe that leaving criminal drug traffickers on our streets rather than putting them in prison where they rightfully belong for killing thousands of Canadians will stop gang violence in Montreal?
Of course not, Ms. Dancho, and having served over a decade on the front lines of our criminal justice system and as a federal prosecutor responsible for prosecuting drug traffickers and not those who are suffering from mental health and other issues, I agree that where appropriate, there do need to be jail sentences, and we must trust our courts and our judges to dispense with justice where appropriate. I will also say with regards to the opioid crisis that our government has put in place measures to stop organized crime and to stop criminals from trafficking in opioids, including at our border. And as I mentioned, I had met with my counterpart, Secretary Americas of DHS in Washington, where we agreed to meet to use the cross-border fine form to interdict the trafficking of illegal drugs, including opioids. And we're seeing CBSA and RCMP make record arrests, which is
yes. Thank you, Minister. You mentioned that in your opening remarks. We just have about a minute left, so I'll just go to my last question. The Minister mentioned a gun buyback program as a primary measure to stop gun violence, although we know gang violence, using guns and drug trafficking is the primary reason we're seeing rising gun crime in our cities. I mean, how many guns does the Minister believe will be handed over to the federal government from criminals in Montreal using a gun buyback or a provincial ban? How many criminals does he anticipate will hand over their illegally possessed guns to the federal government?
Minister, about 20 seconds left in the slot.
Very briefly, Mr. Chair, I would simply say that the buyback program that we are going to introduce...
Minister, the answer is zero. Criminals will not be handing their guns back to you, and they are the ones that are hurting people in our cities. The number is zero, Minister.
Point of order, Chair.
Firearms that may be coming through the border, through those areas of our country.
Thank you for the question, Ms. Dancho. And I will say that the RCMP and others are continuing to engage with First Nations and Indigenous peoples in a collaborative joint effort to ensure that we are cooperating and working together to interdict illegal guns trafficking as much as possible. We have set aside additional investments to...
Minister, I'm sorry to cut you off, but have you had any discussions with First Nations communities on our borders about assisting them with this?
Yes, and we will continue to have those discussions to partner with them. But I also just want to address a couple of other points which you made about our government's priorities, because I do think that they are important. First, with regards to the mandatory buyback, that is an extension of our banning assault rifles. I know, Ms. Dancho, the Conservative Party objected to that policy.
Minister, I'm sorry to cut you off. My question was specifically about what you're doing to speak to border communities, but now that you've answered that, I'm going to cede the rest of my time to my colleague, Mr. Lloyd.
It's up to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few questions for the RCMP and the CBSA. And first of all, thank you all for being here today, and thank you for your hard work and dedication to keeping Canadians safe. To the RCMP, what we're hearing from smaller detachments across the country is that you're very strapped for resources, particularly as violent crime and gang activity is spreading from our urban centers, our large urban centers, to smaller communities outside of our major cities. And this is of grave concern to me, as I'm sure it is all Canadians. We also see issues with rising opioid deaths. We know that hard drug trafficking is increasing as well. And it seems that there's less and less police resources and police individuals to tackle these issues. So I'm wondering if you can just comment in a broader sense of if the Liberal government or a federal government were to provide your department an additional $1 billion to combat gang violence and illegally smuggled firearms and illegally possessed firearms, how would that help, and how would you apply that $1 billion?
Thank you. Like I said earlier, we can always use with more resources. The border is a huge border. We are working towards advancing our technology. In that, we're doing a study to identify the gaps, for example, across the borders, so we can see if there's some technological solutions that would close that gap. So there's that one part. We also, because gang activity is mostly in the bigger centers, of course, when we look at the Lower Mainland, we do invest in a lot of the gang activity through gang suppression teams, and they are successful when we concentrate our efforts. Obviously, we don't have the benefit of having that in all of our detachments, as they're more of a general duty environment, but we do spread those teams out. We have provincially funded teams through crime reduction and enforcement who try to deal with that 5% of the population that causes 90% of the grief, and we try to use those crime reduction teams that are provincially and federally funded on on a contractual basis, and that's where they can deal with those problems directly. So we would it would be great to have more resources in those areas as well.
And I assume that you can hire many more police officers as well to keep our communities safe and to keep violent gun crime down with $1 billion.
Well, we can always do a lot with $1 billion, that's for
Thank
sure.
Thank you, Commissioner Lucky. I'd also like to ask a similar question to the CBSA as well. We know that COVID protocols at the border are very important, but they are, from what we understand, putting a tremendous strain on our already limited border agents and budgets at the border. So could you comment what an additional $1 billion would do if it was targeted towards gun smuggling and drug trafficking?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Look, we've had significant investments over the past couple of years, and my immediate focus right now is on implementing those investments. And I really do believe, as I said earlier, that the work we're doing on the intelligence with our colleagues to the south, whether it's customs, border protection, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives, or local police jurisdiction, that's where I think the real benefit is going to lie. And we will continue to pursue those relationships and build that picture and do our best to stop these networks from their ability to smuggle.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. But can you, so you're saying that you wouldn't take another $1 billion to stop gun smuggling and drug trafficking?
I would, but it takes time to implement these things. And
Absolutely.
And I think that we want to sort of make sure we put it in the right place.
Yeah, that's right. It does take time. It's unfortunate that a lot of this funding has only come recently in a 6-year mandate from the current government. But moving on, I would like to ask the RCMP and the CBSA, I think it may be more in the RCMP jurisdiction regarding outreach to border communities, particularly communities that straddle the border. We know that there are some Indigenous communities that straddle the border, and we're hearing that there may be some elements of criminal activity that's taking advantage of that and using those territories to smuggle hard drugs and guns, and I'm wondering what you have done or what more can be done to support these communities to keep them safe and to stop criminals from taking advantage of any issues we may see at the border where there's sort of porous activity and illegal activity streaming in. So if you can just enlighten the committee of some of the issues there and how we can better serve those communities on the border.
And enlightenment will be given 10 seconds. I'm sorry.
Oh,
Well, it gives me the opportunity to say that we have joint forces operations with the Akwesasne and Kanesatake and Kanawaki police, and working with them and our international partners, of course, on the U.S. side. And that's the way we're going to tackle it together, as President Ozowski said.
Thank you very much. Thank you.